The average grocery store today has about 40,000 individual items, up from about 200 at the dawn of the 20th century. The humble grocery is a technological marvel that enables me to source nearly anything I need from anywhere, anytime I feel the need to experiment with some new wild-ass crazy cuisine combo. The inputs are hardly ever out of stock and are almost always available at prices that are not prohibitive. It isn't simply availability and low cost. It's reliable availability and reliably low cost. Take this concept of utter availability and apply it to absolutely everything, and you now have a glimmer of the absolute connectivity that underpins the modern globalized economy. The ingredients of today's industrial and consumer goods are only available because they can be moved from literally halfway around the world at low costs and high speeds and in perfect security. Fertilizers, oil, cherries, propylene, single malt whiskey, you name it, it is in motion all the time. Transportation is the ultimate enabler. Most technologies do not fundamentally change us. Consider the contemporary smartphone. It's a flashlight, a music player, a camera, a game console, a fare card, a remote control, a library, a television, a cookbook, a computer. All in one. It hasn't enabled us to do much that's fundamentally new, but it has combined more than a dozen pre-existing devices into one, increasing efficiency and access. Important? Ridiculously. But such improvement-based techs do not fundamentally change who we are. Transport technologies, on the other hand, profoundly alter our relationship with our geography. Today you can jump continents in a few hours. It wasn't always this way. In fact, it was almost never this way. Until a couple hundred years ago, it was rare for any of us to venture more than a few miles from home. The 6 millennia of human history has quite literally been a slow, agonizing crawl along a long, long road. Understand the evolutions and revolutions in how we've traveled from A to B. Understand the connectivity that has made our modern grocery stores and smartphones possible. And you can understand why our world is shaped the way it is, and what wonders and terrors the coming decades will hold for us all. The human body is a frail and ridiculously inefficient form of transporting goods. Imagine you are any random human, from the time of our first emergence as Homo sapiens to about the mid-1700s. Unfortunately for you, your legs are likely your only means of transportation. Wheelbarrows did not become a big deal until about 100 CE. Carts were too expensive for the average peasant until centuries later, even if there were roads to drag them upon. Even waiting around for something as old school as a bicycle would have kept you twiddling your thumbs until the late 18th century, mid-19th if you wanted pedals. There are good reasons traders still use camels even today. For most people, your life, your town, and your livelihood were circumscribed by how far you were willing to walk in a day with a crushing load on your back. That kept towns small. Before industrial techs remade the world, urban areas required nearly a half an acre of farmland per resident to prevent starvation, over 7 times the land we use today, plus another 100 times as much area in forest land to produce charcoal to cook and see the population through winter. It made cities stay small, grow too big, and either A, food must come from too far away, in other words, you starve, or B, you cut down your forest to grow more food locally, and the cutting-edge technology of the day, fire, is denied you. You starve while also freezing to death. Wheels helped, but not as much as you might think. I'm sure you've all heard about Rome's famous roads being one of the greatest achievements of the pre-modern age. Rome's roads stretched from Glasgow to Marrakesh to Baghdad to Odessa, and were roughly equivalent in total length to the roads of modern-day Maine. The Roman road network took 6 centuries, 1 billion labor days to construct, to say nothing of maintenance. The very concept of trade was dubious. You couldn't call ahead to see if the next town over actually needed what you had to sell. And then there's the problem of spoilage. You simply couldn't carry enough food to make long-distance trade viable for anything but the most valuable items. Concrete and asphalt, chemical preservatives, and refrigeration are only a few of those pesky industrial-era technologies that didn't come around until the 1800s. Efficient, regular overland transport for bulk goods, even over relatively short distances, was not just difficult but also economically impossible for just about all of human history. Even bread baskets could not reliably feed themselves. Between 1500 and 1778, France suffered several national famines and dozens of regional famines. The country that has been Europe's largest and most reliable food producer stretching back a millennium, the country that has 3 separate agricultural regions, the country that had, bar none, the best internal transport system of the pre-industrial world. Moving things overland sucks. So we figured out how to move stuff a different way. We figured out how to float. While a camel could move a quarter ton, and ox-drawn carts around a ton, even the earliest bulk ships could move several hundred tons at the fraction of a price per ton. The Romans famously imported most of their capital's food from Egypt. Remember those better-than-world-class Roman roads? In 300 CE, it cost more to move grain 70 miles on those roads than it did to sail it some 1,400 miles from Egypt to Rome. The economics of water transport were so lopsided that some cultures, see government, Dutch, Aztec, Chinese, would rearrange their entire governing systems around the capacity to mobilize labor to dig canals stretching hundreds of miles through rocky, undulating landscapes with little more than stone picks, all to float what was the pinnacle of human transport technology well into the 2nd millennium CE, the lowly barge. By the 14th century, history finally started picking up speed. Sails and nails, oars and rudders, holds and decks, guns and artillery, compasses and astrolabes. And crazy. Don't neglect a liberal infusion of crazy. The fabled Western discovery of the great monsoon winds was made by some Greek maniac willing to sail to the middle of the ocean with no idea what would happen next. Take it all together, and newer, larger, sturdier, faster, better armed ships brought us into the deep-water age at the end of the 15th century. Of course, that's the comfortable way to look at it from the far side of the Industrial Revolution. Just because humanity now could ship goods long distances didn't mean that we did so very often. Post-deepwater but pre-industrial shipments of grain from the Baltic region to continental Western Europe were hardly a regular affair. Even if Anglo-Dutch disputes didn't cut into deliveries, even if the Swedes didn't go all Viking on your ships, even if the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was having a rare good day, half of the end product cost typically still came from transport, with another quarter being racked up as storage fees. Grains produced in the interior, no matter how productive the land, tended to stay there. By the late 1700s, the American colonists come independent Americans did ship some grains across the Atlantic, but it was hardly a steady flow. Few things sucked more than making the grueling 6-week trip only to discover that England had had a bumper harvest. Yet even as ships became more efficient, the intersection of technology and geopolitics left the world divided. Geopolitics demanded that no empire buy food from any other. Even in the rare cases when shipping was thought reliable, the moods and appetites of opposing monarchs were most assuredly not. Geopolitics demanded that food shipments were rarely worth either the cost or the risk. But jade, pepper, cinnamon, porcelain, silk, and tobacco? Totes! It helped a lot that most luxury goods were not perishable. Tea was about as lowbrow a product there was to reliably make the cut. And even that was only because Europeans are weird. The luxuries trade was only considered global because of the distances involved. In reality, there was little trade among the empires. It was more accurately a series of closed systems sharing very few points of contact, and erratic contact at that. Cargoes were limited to the truly valuable, and to the sort of things you could ultimately do without. When you did see a transoceanic cargo vessel, it was a solid bet that disrupting its day would make yours. The Spanish called such disruptors English. The British called such disruptors French. Today, we call such disruptors pirates. As a result of this deliberate disconnectedness, neighbors were less for trading with and more for launching artillery shells into. The civilized world, to use the European lingo of the era, existed in a state of near permanent competition. Bringing order to such chaos was simply impossible. The superior naval power of the day, the Spanish in the 17th and early 18th centuries, or the English in the late 18th and 19th centuries, would attempt to convince everyone they were large and in charge, but this was before the age of radar and cruise missiles. There was a lot of ocean to patrol. Rivals had compelling strategic and economic reasons to muck things up. Any order would only hold within sight of their military vessels. The new technologies of the early industrial era, post-textiles, pre-steel ships, somewhat widened the range of goods that could be transported economically, which in turn carved out room for a new tier of country, the middlemen who brokered or ferried goods among opposing empires. It was risky business. The deals an empire categorized as brokering on Monday were often reclassified as double dealing by Thursday. The Dutch, every European's favorite middlemen, became notorious for their massive booms when they carried European trade, and massive busts when the British or French or Germans decided they had had enough of the Dutch trading with the other side. The Americans learned this lesson early and often. Many of the early geopolitical nightmares for the young country centered on trade of the decidedly Dutch variety. America's first major strategic row, the Quasi-War of 1798 to 1800, centered on French seizures of neutral American shipping to Britain. The Brits made some popcorn for the coming fight and had the nerve to talk shit about France to the recently independent Americans, but they were ultimately disappointed when both sides backed down. Just 12 years later, the Americans found themselves again in the middle of a British-French war, their third if you include the American Revolution. This time around, France was run by Napoleon. The British were particularly aggressive in interdicting American ships they deemed blockade breakers, even impressing crews on American-flagged ships into the Royal Navy. The Brits were total tools in this period. They didn't recognize naturalized American citizenship. So anyone who was born in the colonies was fair game for impressment. Born in 1775 in Philadelphia, yo, you're still a British subject. Get in my navy. Yada yada stuff happened, things were said, triggers were pulled, torches were thrown, and before you knew it, the Brits were roasting marshmallows over the coals of the former White House. And the Canadians became forever unsure just how much they could trust the Yanks. And yet, it was stunning, shocking how much did not change. At the close of the pre-industrial era, most economies were still either self-contained or subjugated in one way or another, with the cities that enjoyed navigable rivers or safe coasts largely dominating. For while the economics and mechanics of overseas travel had improved remarkably over the centuries, overland travel had only seen occasional improvements. It wasn't that nothing had gotten better. There had been steady advances in horse breeding, nutrient-rich feeding, harnessing, and so on. Every bit of reach meant more access to resources to power industry, or access to new towns that could trade with the outside world. But unlike the thousand-fold improvements in movement by water, movement by land in 1820 looked an awful lot like it did for the Romans, just with, in many cases, worse roads. Even as recently as the time of the Oregon Trail, you would not be happy but instead thrilled should your ox-drawn cart manage to clock 15 miles a day. While the technological advances in things like horseshoes and steel axles did lay important groundwork for what would come, these technologies didn't fundamentally change how we moved either ourselves or our stuff. And they couldn't, and they wouldn't. That is until such time that a completely new technological suite boiled forth and changed everything.